Good afternoon. I'm Arun Serafin, the Executive Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. I want to thank all attendees for your support of NDIA and ETI and for joining us for today's webinar, Contested Logistics 101. This webinar is part of our Tech 101 series, where we present complex concepts as introductory webinars with a focus on their national security implications. Today's session is not one of our traditional Tech 101s. We're going to focus on a challenge facing the military today and not a specific technology area. Today, we're going to talk about contested logistics. Contested logistics refers to the challenges and complexities involved in the supply and sustainment of operations in competitive environments, which may include active military operations. In contested environments, adversaries aim to disrupt, delay, or even destroy logistics capabilities. So the webinar will explore the concept of contested logistics, highlighting how it differs from traditional logistics. It'll also discuss the role of new technologies and methodologies in mitigating the unique challenges of these contested environments. Some administrative items before we get started. First, all attendee lines are muted. If you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. You can submit questions anytime during the presentation. We'll do our best to get through all of the questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. We're recording today's webinar for members unable to attend, and for any member who wishes to view it at a later date, we'll post it on our website and on our YouTube channel. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers today. Our guests today are executive fellows from the Institute for Defense and Business, General Edward Daly and Logan Jones. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. General Daly retired in 2023 after 36 years of service in the United States Army. In his last assignment, he served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army Materiel Command, which is a 4-star billet, and I had the opportunity to have some time to work with him in that role. AMC is one of the Army's largest commands with nearly 200,000 military, civilian, and contractor personnel, and it oversees acquisition, including R&D, logistics, and sustainment and installation support, among other things, for the Army and many other parts of DoD. It has a presence in 50 states and more than 150 countries. Joining him is Logan Jones, who's the CEO of SciFly Aviation and a member of NDIA's board of directors. He has over a decade of national security experience working with both the government and defense and commercial industry. He's also the former vice president and founding member of one of the largest aerospace venture funds, Boeing's Horizon X. Both of our presenters that are joining us today are executive fellows from the Institute for Defense and Business, which is one of NDIA's partner organizations. They help enrich IDB's educational programs by bringing the perspective of retired U.S. DoD and military senior leaders, as well as current private industry senior executives into the learning environment. Typically, one of their fellows will attend each program that IDB runs for 1 or more days. Their role is to provide thought leadership on relevant topics addressed in the program curriculum, as well as to mentor, coach, and advise participants during the program and often long beyond. Programs offered by the Institute for Defense and Business, which is a not-for-profit education institution, target leaders at all levels in multiple functional areas. They're designed to provide the knowledge, skills, and tools needed to better equip leaders to implement impactful change. Some areas of studies include strategy, innovation, risk management, contested logistics, data fluency, AI, and critical thinking. Programs at the IDB educate, energize, and provide leaders with the intellectual capital critical to successful transformation. And we're going to get to see an example of some of IDB's efforts right here today. So with that, I want to thank General Daly and Logan for joining us today. And I guess I'm going to turn it over to General Daly to begin the presentation.
Hey, Arun, thanks so much. And really appreciate NDIA Emerging Technologies Institute. First, if you hear the siren behind me, I'm in downtown Chicago. So hopefully the siren will continue on here. But thanks for ETI inviting me and Logan to be part of this, and I appreciate the partnership with IDB. I know Clark Streets is on the line as well. We were really looking forward to this opportunity to talk about contested logistics, and as you mentioned, kind of how you define it in the outset. What we wanted to do today, Logan and I'm honored to be part of this webinar with Logan, given his expertise and how he looks at this in the framework. But, when you look at the DoD approach to contested logistics, there are a couple of things that jump out. One is that the word contested sometimes takes a very complicated, very integrated, very synchronized approach, and sometimes myopically focuses it on a kinetic, disruptive, denial approach where if you focus on that piece, you lose the context of logistics really in the 21st century supporting multi-domain operations from the tactical to the operational and strategic levels. The second piece, I think it's important, is that, people always look for a process owner. And it's like, if the topic was money, who owns money? Well, what's the currency of money, whether it's foreign, domestic? Are you looking at banks? Are you looking at exchange organizations? Are you looking at, different types of money, gold standard, et cetera? So there is no one process owner. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the strengths in how we look at logistics in the 21st century. The third piece is that sometimes we look at it through a DoD lens, and when you look at the stakeholders from the tactical level to the strategic level, whether it's the joint force, the individual services, the functional combatant commands, the COCOMs themselves, allies and partners, et cetera, I think where it stops usually is at the strategic level at either the military's organic industrial base or forts, ports, bases, and stations, and sometimes divorces itself of the organic or the defense industrial base, which is hugely impactful on our ability to conduct logistics. And then the last piece I think that people tend to forget about is that the acquisition processes and just the sheer volume of resources involved in these different parts of the equation to get at logistics in support of operations sometimes is cost prohibitive. So having said that, our focus today is going to be to really look at contested logistics a little bit differently, to focus on what we believe are critical required logistics capabilities in support of combat operations, and then pulling the thread even more and talk about principles and leveraging of technology at the tactical operational level. So when you start, let me start with if I were really trying to understand not just contested logistics, but logistics writ large within the DoD, there's three documents that I would read. Because the really start point for this whole concept of joint logistics and then contested logistics starts with a 2015 document produced by the Joint Staff and DoD, and that is the Joint Concept for Logistics. I think that's a good baseline of understanding how we define it from a joint perspective, and even leads into how the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, et cetera, I define it. The second document I would read is a white paper that's named Contested Logistics, Who's in Charge? And it's written by a consultant company called Cypress International. It's available on if you just search it on Google or any other search engine. And it's about a 30-page document that really goes through the 101 and talks about different definitions, principles, scope, players, stakeholders, processes, et cetera. And so I think that really is a good baseline of really framework and foundational understanding. And then the third document that I would read, it's a book actually. It's a historical account, and it's a book by Arthur Herman. It's called Freedom's Forge. And it talks about pre-World War II, setting the conditions to fight a large-scale combat operations. In this case, it was the Second World War, and what had to happen, and all of the stakeholders that really have had to leverage capabilities, identify gaps, scale capabilities and capacity to be able to support the war that was at hand. I would just recommend those up front. When you look at logistics, I'm often reminded by a quote by General MacArthur, and he said, "You will not find it hard or difficult to prove that in battles, campaigns, and even wars, that they're won and lost predominantly because of logistics." And so, if you look at logistics in terms of its purest definition, it's the processes and resources and systems that are involved in not only generating combat power and capability for the services in the joint force, but transporting that combat power to the point of need, sustaining that combat power in an area of operation, and then redeploying that force home to reset it, rearm it, and really conduct repair, overhaul, and reconstitution of forces. The means and ways, you talk about in today's environment, it's a multi-domain environment, right? So it's not singularly domained in terms of, although there are prominent areas like, Europe where it's a land dominant domain, in the Pacific, it's a maritime dominant domain. So the principles stay the same, but maybe some of the details and capabilities are a little bit leveraged differently. But the whole focus really of logistics is to extend operational reach in a multi-domain environment. It's to prolong endurance of military operations and ensure freedom of movement for combatant commander in a regional geographic command. When you look at it, it's everything from concept to capability to programming and resources. As I mentioned, it involves stakeholders from the joint force to allies and partners to industry and commercial sector organizations. There are numerous documents that are written on it in terms of doctrine, concepts by service, and then even at the joint level. And so when you really start to pare it back, and then you start looking at challenges, and as Arun mentioned in the outset, those challenges really threaten to disrupt, deny, or destroy capability that would then cause combat operations to culminate in an expanded multi-domain environment and not be able to achieve military objectives in support of really the overarching, more strategic objectives of national security. So when you look at that and you look at all the geopolitical pieces, you look at the principles of it, and then you start paring it down and looking at specifically, the tactical and operational level. What are the things that really need to be focused on? Where do we really need to put our efforts from a standpoint of logistics to ensure that you can get the maximized effects, right, in supporting combat operations? And I think, quite frankly, it revolves around looking at it through the lens of where you have what I call precision logistics enabled by AI and ML, right? So machine learning, predictive analysis, and software applications, visualization tools, etc. The second piece is there are certain capabilities that you want to put to ensure agile basing of assets and stocks and commodities. There has to be means by which you look at energy reduction, right, and consumption reduction to reduce the burden, especially in 21st century warfare, where you have systems where their rates of fire are so high, et cetera. Logistics sometimes just can't keep up with the operational tempo. And so whether you're reducing the burden in terms of energy by looking at hybrid electric propulsion or electric power, or you're looking at generating, atmospheric water generation from air, right, to reduce the requirement for water on the battlefield. Advanced systems like, as an example, air, ground, and vessels that are attritable, small, low cost, but can move material, so they're unmanned in a lot of cases. And 3D printing, not just of repair parts and those types of things, but there's technologies out there where you can literally 3D print buildings and fighting positions and ammunition bunkers, et cetera. So leveraging those capabilities are huge going forward. And so I'm gonna pause there because I hit some of the overarching pieces as we pull the thread and really focus it on the tactical level technology and really enabling principles that Logan's going to talk about, and then really open it up for questions. So, Logan?
Yeah, thanks, General Daly. And, you're right. This is a topic that's so broad. I mean, we can't cover everything, certainly in an hour. It is a little bit like money, but one thing I know you well enough to say you are modest in the description that you have been one of the thought leaders in this space over the past decade. And so while it might be like money and, there's a lot of different categories and hands that touch it, it's great to share the time with you. What's great, I think, is we come at it from two different angles. And so my introduction to this topic actually started when I was young. Now, like many of you, I had a grandfather who fought in World War II. He was a part of the 384th Heavy Bombardment Group. This was a group of B-17s that was critical for the air campaign in Europe. In fact, he earned a Bronze Star for his 33 combat missions, and it was only the battle wagon, his plane, that came back on an October day in 1943 and landed safely back at the base at Grafton Underwood. And what I remember most about conversations with him was he had this license plate holder. And the license plate holder said, the 384th Heavy Bombardment Group, and it had the motto. And the motto was, keep the show on the road. And I asked him what it meant. I'm a little kid at the time. What the heck does that mean? And he says, well, it's pretty simple. It's all about being ready to fly when you're called upon, about, maintaining the aircraft in a state that's sturdy to survive combat and battle. He was a crew chief. That was his job. And I, over my career, which, it's almost been, I can't believe it, 20 years in the industry, this idea of the next fight being a very contested space where we have to be ready to fight, but I think uniquely we have to be adaptive to the environment, really calls upon two different categories of implementation that's really important when it comes down to the tactical edge. The two categories, one being technology, which I'll talk about through a scenario. And then I think there's acquisition policy items as well that really touch how you implement the technology. So maybe we talk through an example, and General Daly, you and I can kind of build upon it together. But one that comes to mind that could be a real scenario at some point in the future. Imagine you have a forward deployed unit of Marines in the Pacific. They're stuck or stationed on a small island. Now, for the Marines on the call, this is made up. Marines don't get stuck on islands. There's no chance of that. But imagine that in that contested environment that General Daly talked about, it's across all domains. You have cyber attacks, disruptions to GPS, supply lines cut off. And this unit is running low on critical supplies, things like fuel, medical equipment, comms equipment, bullets and ammo. They need help and they need it fast. So as an example of how technology comes into play, and it hits on every one of those categories you just talked about, General Daly, it's things like distributed compute and machine learning or artificial intelligence at the edge. So what is that, right? What does that mean? Picture a small unmanned vehicle embedded compute that can survey the area, but it doesn't have to send back information to a central location. It can automatically identify areas that are safe for landing, areas that are safe for resupply. And it can communicate only the essential information that might be enabled through resilient communications, things like mesh networking that's distributed all the way out to the edge. Well, that requires innovation, adaptability, but it's also readily available in the world today, as we've seen this explosion in the Internet of Things, the whole category of robotics. Now think about how they get supplies onto the island to feed the force. Well, there might be autonomous vessels that can load up and ship material out. It might be airborne assets. So unique, innovative approaches to lift that don't consume resources in the same way or compete with what's needed with that forward deployed Marine force who's stationed on the island. Things like power and energy at the edge, getting that Marine unit to last as long as possible until the environmental conditions can warrant a safe distribution of supplies to the forward edge. And another topic that General Daly talked about is this whole category of predictive analytics. How do you build in intelligence at every layer of the mission so that you enhance resiliency and speed of decision making? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, certainly been a catchphrase in DoD, but I think it's truly important. It's very important. And the reason why we believe it's important is it's all about reducing complexity, taking a ton of information that exists in the world and reducing it down with speed and quality to help make a decision at the time that it's needed. That's what it does. In order to get there, we have to make some investments as DoD and as the Defense Industrial Base to lead toward that future. Things like making everything possible a sensor, pushing compute and power to the edge so that you're not constantly limited by the bandwidth constraints calling back to base. And then, enabling the force through an acquisition system that can keep up with the pace of technology. And the way that I look at this, and General Daly, this is where you spent the last part of your career. I think that we really have a couple different options. Number one is, we can either slow down the technology, extend the technology curves to meet the acquisition system, or we can find a way to speed up the pace of the acquisition system to adopt the best of technology that exists today. I think only one of those is a winning strategy. And so for those who are on this webinar, who are in acquisition, I have a couple of ideas, but look at ways at accelerating the adoption of commercial technologies out there. This has been invented and deployed in the commercial world. It's a matter of getting it into the hands who need it. So General Daly, that's a focus on an environment in the Pacific that's very water-centric. How would you think about that applying to a land-based battle somewhere in Europe or other places?
Yeah, so Logan, that's a great question, right? And so I love your approach on really juxtaposing technology with enablers and authorities and policies that really bring effects. Because as you know, I talk about an expanded battle space, but if you're making decisions at the time you realize the decision has to be made, you're late to need. So how do you preemptively leverage technology and decision-making tools, to your point on predictive analytics, to facilitate decision-making early enough so that you're achieving the right effect to continue to enable combat operations? And it's huge, to your point. When you look at Europe as an example, land-dominant domain, and just taking as an example, Ukraine, it's not surprising to know that Ukraine received and was gifted huge amounts of ammunition and material from other countries, and in particular, the United States. And so making sure that they didn't culminate in terms of not having enough ammunition or combat power, the readiness of the equipment, the right people, et cetera, their capabilities weren't degraded to the point where it affected the fight, has always been a problem since, 2022. And so how do you stay ahead of that? Well, data analytics, et cetera. So the scenario would be if you know what the upcoming operations are in terms of rates of fire of ammunition, as an example, right? And you know what the on-hand stocks are and the territorial boundaries of, as an example, 155 millimeter ammunition, and you know what's available in Europe from NATO countries in that specific millimeter range, and then you know what you're producing in the United States in our industrial base, and you know what our stockages are around the world, then it becomes really a math problem on what do you need into the future, when will you run out of ammunition, what kind of resources do you need to put into and money do you need to put into other vendors that can produce 1.5 ammunition, all those types of things. But really, you're being asked to make sure that you continue to enable the Ukrainians to fight with, as an example, 1.55 ammunition. Because if you just wait until demand, it's too late. So this is the example of extending really from the tactical to the strategic level, the looking at this commodity of 1.55 ammunition and leveraging really predictive analytics early enough to be able to make decisions and maintain maneuver space, so to speak, or decision space for individuals who can go out and get the resources or increase capacity, et cetera. So I think your example is the Pacific is huge, but you can see that when you look at logistics, it's if you look at it myopically in a certain vacuum and you just say, okay, what's the status of ammunition, as an example, in Ukraine, you lose the value of really being able to leverage the sophistication, the complexity, but the power, right, of the logistics enterprise in totality.
Yeah, I'm just looking at questions rolling in, and one that I think we can actually do this interactively. It's a lot more enjoyable that way. But the first one I think is an area that I've focused on for quite some time, and I would look at this. And so the question, I don't know if everybody can see it, but it's essentially, General Daly, you mentioned that there's low cost uncrewed systems that would be great for logistics, needed for the mission. When we look at the vast distances that the Pacific AOR carries with it, really, can we create low-cost UAVs that have the right capacity and range? And so I would maybe look at this in two different ways, personally. Number one is, yes, there is. I mean, this is just a set of decisions on what trades and requirements you're pushing out to create these systems. So as examples, just companies that come to mind, there's a company called Whisper that's focused on ducted fans. There's Wave that's focused on pulse jets. Look, these are different ways at getting enough power on a system to move, right? And this is about innovation. It's coming from outside DoD and pushing its way into more traditional circles, but they're outsiders trying to break in. The company that I lead, it's all about kind of reinventing the configuration of lift to fly low and slow, but really long distances with either all electric or hybrid electric propulsion systems. And it's super affordable. But it's really about how you then bring this in and get it adopted within DoD. In my view, it's less of a technology problem, more of a how do you implement, how do you buy problem. So the second lens that I look at this question through is really the system of adoption. One area that I think we have a massive opportunity in the defense industrial base is really restructuring contracts with companies like CLS providers that drive an incentive to adopt technology like this, changes the risk profile, puts a greater focus on performance-based contracts, so that if you're ordering lift, maybe you stipulate reliability rates, maybe there's a time component to it, but really allow them to bring this technology in and offer it as a service into DoD to have the effect that's a great way to begin bridging the gap between where we are outside of DoD with technology and where the mission is requiring it today. So hopefully that helps. General Daly, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think so first, these questions are fantastic. I mean, this is the level of sophistication as you progress and continue to look at logistics writ large, even if it's under one set of conditions and assumptions with it being contested, it is really, really, I think, essential to look at it holistically. And the first question that's on there, I would just tell you that you have to, when you look at technologies, you can't look at technologies, disruptive technologies in particular, as a panacea. So don't think about disruptive technologies in terms of being the connector between the strategic and the tactical level. You have to juxtapose a couple of different things. I believe that it's a combination. This is the level of complexity where it's agile basing and positioning forward in, as an example, the Pacific AOR. So whether that's pre-positioned stocks, agile basing of units that, whether you're talking first, second island chain, et cetera. And then you juxtapose these emerging technologies that, we have to be careful not to take the technologies as they are static, and the nature, and many of you up on the webinar know this, is that they're very dynamic and they're emerging, and there's rapid, quite frankly, prototyping and improvements being done as we speak. And so you may say, as an example, if you look at unmanned vessels and unmanned aerial systems, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it would have been tough to find a company, and I know several between, companies like Beta, et cetera, to find a company that could put a payload together with an electric autonomous vehicle that was vertical takeoff and landing, that would meet some pretty good or substantial requirements. As we go forward now, all those companies are developing. In particular, I'll mention Beta, where the payload is getting bigger, much bigger. Being quite frankly battery powered, the batteries are getting more sophisticated, and so now the linkage between agile basing and these disruptive technologies, not only now but as it progresses in the future, gives you way more operational reach. And to Logan's point, I think, the continued focus on streamlining through other transactional authorities and contracting and acquisition mechanisms so that you can do it more rapidly in stride, as opposed to slower, more bureaucratic, larger programs of record. I mean, the Ukrainians are doing it as well, right? They are changing drone structure in weeks, making them more lethal, right, with a higher range, with better optics, et cetera. And so I think you have to combine concept, positioning with technology, right, and be unencumbered by policy regulations, et cetera, in the acquisition arena to really get the effects you want to achieve, especially as we move forward over the next 10 years, because everybody's adapting. The last thing I would tell you, and I know I talked a lot on this question, but we have to leverage direct commercial sales, foreign military sales, and capabilities of our partners and allies, because we can't do it alone. And that gives us, right, embedded footprints and interoperable solutions potentially that we can partner and use forward in different countries. So that gets us the effect sometimes at the tactical level.
Awesome. Arun, should we take some more questions?
Yeah, Logan, you want me to fire them away from reading them here?
Sure.
Okay, so one of the questions talks about, you both talked about data analytics being important, and this gets into the ability to use advanced technologies like AI quantum, other algorithms, quantum computing, for example, to do some of that data analytics. Have you seen examples where we've got a shortfall of our ability to do that kind of computation or analysis? Or, and there's a crying need for us to, there's a use case in some of what you're describing. It's complex enough that it needs that kind of thing.
Maybe from an industry lens, maybe I'll give you my view of it, and then General Daly, you can talk about how it meets the force, maybe. Of course, there's an issue with it, Arun, and I actually don't think it's a deficiency necessarily with the industry, with DoD in this case. It's actually just how relatively fast and rapid things are changing on the technology front. And one of the things that I have talked about, is how to deploy R&D dollars within DoD and support of this technology. And something that I would advocate against is like trying to go way far to the left on some of this technology. Quantum might be a different space, but I'm really focused on AI and ML. There has been so much rapid change over the past, certainly 2 years, but even the past 6 months in this technology category. DoD really should focus its energy on staying close and adapting what's available out there. That's the only way that we can keep pace and drive it into the force. And those R&D dollars should be around adapting. So training and tuning models, ensuring security, which is unique to DoD, pushing and installing, investing in distributed compute. So putting sensors and compute and power as far out into the mission and increasing the cycle rates of technology refreshes would be a huge advantage. There's another question that's related to this, is you also can't look at this as just adopting software. The hardware and software go together. It's not one or the other, it's the combination of both. And so as DoD, the services, work on improving the clock speed of adopting software, they can't lose sight of the fact it can't run on devices made in the late 1990s. You have to have a clock speed close to parity between the two, or creating hardware compute at the edge that exceeds what's needed today. But really seeing those as a symbiotic relationship where they work in tandem together. But there's absolutely a gap of today because the technology is moving at such a rapid speed. General Daly, what about the view from the force?
Yeah, so I think so. First of all, I agree 1,000% with Logan. I think there's an inextricable link between the hardware and software piece. That's one. Two is that I believe that generally speaking, that you have many people in DoD who really want to progress in these areas of AI, ML very, very quickly. But we are constrained, quite frankly, the way we've thought about it in the past, that it is very lockstep in approach, and you can't rapidly adjust, refine, purchase, the right software system and even services, right? Because I think we have to decentralize and control less what we're doing at echelon. So I remember when I was in uniform, just even a couple of years ago, I wanted to really have data scientists, software engineers at echelon, so that we could literally those individuals could sit next to operators and develop the tools, refine the tools that would facilitate responsive decision making. And that was different because the tendency was to centralize it and control it, and to do it in a way that was not at the speed of relevance. And so I think you're exactly right. And I think we have to stop controlling, decentralize it, free up more dollars, and give more autonomy at echelon for decision making, because at every level, leaders, whether you're commanders or staff or supporting those operations in any capacity, you need to see certain information is relevant to you. And I think we got to stop thinking about control and centralized monolithic ERPs and really leverage microservices, APIs, et cetera, and just be able to be able to connect the databases and the tools as opposed to control them through this monolithic process that we've been used to.
That would certainly enhance resiliency too, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's speed, resiliency, quality, all of it. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, another question, and I'm going to ask you guys to do speed round answers a little bit so we can get through more here. What strategies or contingency plans are being developed to address potential challenges that are going to be created by things like export control limitations, by distro D statements that say U.S. government and contractor only, when we're trying to do more to support deployed forces in remote areas, try to use local sourcing of supplies, even use commercial off-the-shelf technologies and items. Do you feel like these restrictions are going to get in the way, and is there anything being done to try to address those issues?
Yeah, so I would just tell you, I'll jump in here. I mean, I think those are problematic, especially, you know, I mean, I replete with examples worldwide where you run into, you know, who's the exporter of record, who's the importer of record, is it ITAR compliant, is it not? Do you have to go foreign military sales, direct commercial sales? There are a myriad of bureaucratic policies and statutes and laws in place by country and et cetera. I think those start to go away when you hit some trigger of threat. You know, I don't know where that, I think I know where that is. It's certainly not in a contingency operation. It's certainly not in a training exercise. But when you get to, you know, something that involves more escalated response and hostilities, then you start to see those controls be relieved. And there's a level of frustration in peacetime that, you know, is just the nature of doing business. And, you know, it is very, very difficult. You know, I have a business now, and one of the biggest things we talked about yesterday is I'm trying to get product into Ukraine, and I'm running into custom and export problems, and it's trying to help Ukraine, and the problem is with Ukrainians, right? Giving me the exceptions or the custom exemptions. So I would just tell you that this is just part of doing business, and this is why, you know, if logistics were easy, that it'd be given to tacticians and operators. You know, professionals work logistics because it's the most complex problem sets.
It's also why AUKUS is so important, I would add. I mean, that's
right.
kind of a pathfinder to really
That's
push
right.
the sanity.
Yeah, right. That's right.
You talk about the mission being so diverse, not geographically, but even organizationally, across all of the DoD logistics enterprise. As industries trying to navigate this space, they run into a system which often uses, and this is true, sustainments and logistics innovation, R&D and technology development that goes into it. It's often used as a bill payer to support kinetic effects that logistics is trying to support itself. How does industry get to see a clear demand signal that DoD wants to invest in this? What do you think DoD should be doing to create that demand signal?
That's an excellent question, because I've suffered from it. I mean, one of the things that I would point when I'd have conversations with DoD is like almost lamenting that, you know, in a relatively stable world, so it's a few years ago, sustainment logistics just is not as sexy as big airplanes and things that go boom. And so experimentation, innovation, going through the paces in this category was really hard to get funding for. It was always that next thing that we would fund. So I think joint experimentation and really looking at what is being adopted in commercial best practices, like the shipping industry as an example. You know, they have digital platforms that are really complex. I mean, when an oil tanker moves from the Middle East to fulfill demand, there's all sorts of things that go into it. Things like weather, pricing, routes, personnel availability, ship availability, and like they're doing that today. One of the limiters that, if I'm optimistic about something, I think the push over the last 3 years or so in DoD to actually have better standardization around data to lead to better data availability will help us increase the velocity of experimentation within the space. It's always very difficult to get your hands on the data so that you can go through this experimentation and simulation. And so that's one thing I would point to that's helped. General Daly, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, just to tag on to what you just said, Logan, I think, when you look at the demand signal, starting with the joint warfighting concept, and then from that, you look at logistics, the joint concept for contested logistics, which is the concept under that. And from that, you really define where the threats are, what the required capabilities are, where the gaps are, and then where you invest resources. Where it winds up, it doesn't wind up at the joint level in terms of resourcing those gaps. It winds up at the service level. So if you look at, as an example, a joint resource, requirements oversight council memorandum, they really divvy up those responsibilities to fill gaps at the tactical operational level to the services. So in essence, it's pushed down to the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And I can tell you from the Army's perspective, that's why we established the cross-functional team for contested logistics. I did that before I left the military because I knew that logistics always gets left on the cutting room floor. To Logan's point, right? It's not the sexy stuff, and unfortunately, it becomes the bill payer for other warfighting function capabilities. And so, I think the more we just continue to identify that, logistics is not just an enabler; it's a necessity to fight and win. Is important going forward. But I'm starting to see some change, shifts of the needle a little bit.
Now, along those lines, then, who would you advise people to go to at this point? What are the best front doors? There is no PEO contested logistics, to my knowledge.
Yeah, so this is a great point, Arun. PEOs, as you know, they're a material developer. They take their requirements from somebody else. I would put it in this category, and I'll use the Army as an example. If you're looking at a developed TRL level 7 or more right now, then you'd go to for a logistics capability, right? Or technology. But if you're a TRL 7 or above, then you would go to Combined Arms Support Command, and the Capabilities Development Integration Division at Fort Craig Adams. They're working and looking at what are the requirements that they want to hand to a PEO to build and develop the material and invest in it over time. If you're looking at something that's an immature TRL level, to Logan's earlier point on S&T, research and development, much more nascent in terms of development, then you want to go to the cross-functional team on contested logistics in the Army in Huntsville, Alabama, because they're looking at 2030 to 2040 timeframe. And so what I recommend to people is first assess what the development of your capability, if it's in the logistics arena, and then two, focus your efforts from there.
There's a couple of questions on the challenge of the geographic diversity of any contested logistics operations, and the need to realize that the enemy is going to go after this geographically spread logistics chains. So what are we doing then to harden our supply lines, cyber and physical, to against attack in this contested environment?
Yeah, if I could jump in there, Logan, and I go to you then, if that's all right. So I think you got to look at threats and challenges in totality. And so, this is the danger as you talk contested logistics, the tendency to go, I think, to a kinetic, sort of threat and challenge, and potentially leaving out and divorcing yourselves of the discussions of even anti-access, area denial, the tyranny of speed, cyber, supply chain vulnerabilities, the geopolitical pieces of just what raw materials, chemical precursors are available in certain countries that will just stop supplying you, right? So there's a myriad of different challenges. In addition to the kinetic pieces where you need to harden your lines of communication. And I think the way you have to do it is you have to my earlier point, we can't stop it within DoD in terms of building a capability. It has to be more of a wider network to look at the defense industrial complex, other partners and allies. So now you have redundancy throughout the world. And the notion isn't that, well, if I want to get things repaired or if I want to produce ammunition, it just doesn't come from Scranton, Army ammunition point or Iowa or Lake City, right? There are alternate sources of locations of storage and production worldwide. So I have a network of capability that builds a necessary redundancy. And this is absolutely, dismissed by many people because redundancy involves cost. Redundancy reduces risk, but it increased cost. And this is where we have to start changing the narrative, say the threat drives, right? Not just kinetic threat, but geopolitical, economic, diplomatic, all those other pieces drive threat to the level that it requires you to be redundant in nature in order to be successful. And that's where I think we've been problematic because we want to wish away the redundancy, right? Reduce cost, and therefore the programming is much easier.
One of the viewers for today, Mark Thompson, thanks for this. He added on to the Army part of your answer of the front doors and mentioned that ASNRDA, which is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, Acquisition, has directed the establishment of new program offices, PMOs, under their PEO for industrial infrastructure. The new PMOs are called PMO 314. Do you know all your Navy numbers, General Daly? You got to know 314, Logistics Over the Shore, and PMO 305, Navy Expeditionary Systems. And those might be good front doors for higher TRL logistics related systems and technologies. All right, we're running completely out of time, but let me ask you one last question. What's your sense of how good a job we're doing? You mentioned on experimentation, but also on wargaming. Are we actually wargaming scenarios which represent real contested logistics, or does logistics still get white carded in war games?
Yeah, so I would just tell you that I think we've gotten a little bit better, but joint warfighting concept, and quite frankly, even in the service project convergence, PCC5, the other wargaming experimentation, et cetera, I think we have now turned the corner where we're starting, as opposed to assuming it away, white carding to the point, we're starting to address it a little bit more. But I think you address it a little bit more, but the more you address it, you realize that you start eating into required resources very, very quickly. So I still think we have a long way to go. But my last point, Arun, I thought you were going to ask me about my prediction on the Army Notre Dame score this weekend. I can give that to you at the end if you want, but I thought that's where you were going with the question.
All right, with that, there's other big football games coming up you didn't comment on either. So, okay, we'll leave it. I want to thank our speakers today, Logan and General Daly, for the great presentation and answering the questions. I want to thank everyone for their attendance and all your questions. We're going to, like I said, post the recording online as soon as possible and some of the links to the documents that were mentioned. If you have feedback about this event, especially topics you'd like to see us cover in the future, please email us at eti@ndia.org. I want to take this opportunity to highlight a few of our upcoming events. In January 24th, 2025, we're having a Power of Prototyping Symposium with our colleagues from the George Mason Baroni Center for Government Contracting and the National Armaments Consortium. That'll be at the Arlington campus of George Mason University. Information will be available at ndia.org/events. It's built off of a paper that we're working on with George Mason and NAC on industry perspectives on best practices for prototyping programs. The next in the series of Tech 101 webinars is December 12th. It's going to be on antenna technologies. Registration information will also be available at ndia.org/events. And then I wanted to point everyone to our podcast. Comes out every other week, available on YouTube and all your other normal podcast platforms. There's a QR code to find our podcast. Guests in the past have included government officials like Ms. Hsu. We've talked about the National Defense Industrial Strategy, new initiatives like Defense Civilian Training Corps, and lots of other things. The current one out right now is with Sue Gordon, and it talks about how small businesses need to get better access to classified spaces and security clearances in order to really contribute to the defense industrial base. So I recommend everyone to like and subscribe my podcast. With that, I want to make sure everyone knows to register for these and find out all the other things that NDIA is doing. Please go to ndia.org. And thanks again, General Daly and Logan, for the great presentation, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome.